The Oddity of Bundling, an Introduction. Picture explaining to your deeply religious parents that you'd like to spend the night in bed with your girlfriend. Now picture them saying, "Of course, dear, I'll put a board down the middle to keep things proper," and then going to sleep in the next room while you and Sarah lie inches apart in the darkness. This wasn't rebellion. This was bundling, the standard courtship practice in Puritan New England. What seems insane made perfect sense back then. Before we dive into this wild story, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into bed, let yourself relax. If you're new here, welcome to Hearts and History, where we explore love stories that sound too crazy to be true. Hit subscribe if you want more of these bedtime history tales. And drop a comment, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I love hearing from you night owls and early birds alike. New England, winter 1750. Sarah pulls her wool nightgown tight as Samuel climbs into her bed. Her parents are 20 feet away in the next room. They can hear everything: rustling covers, whispered conversations, nervous laughter. But this isn't scandalous. This is Tuesday night. Samuel's been courting Sarah for 6 weeks now, walking 3 miles from his family's farm every few days. Tonight her father finally said the words every young Puritan man hoped to hear. "You can bundle with my daughter." The wooden board between them feels symbolic more than anything else. It's maybe 18 inches tall, runs the length of the bed. Samuel can reach over it easily if he wants. Sarah knows this. Her parents know this. Everyone knows this. But the board matters anyway. It shows they're trying to be proper, trying to follow the rules while bending them just enough to let young people actually get to know each other in a world where privacy doesn't exist. See, here's what you have to understand about 1700s New England. Winters are brutal. Fuel costs money they don't have. Most houses have 1 heated room, maybe 2 if the family's well off. When Samuel shows up at sunset to court Sarah, her parents face a choice: keep the parlor fire burning all night for 2 teenagers to sit awkwardly on wooden chairs, or let them bundle in Sarah's bed where they can actually talk without freezing to death. Sarah's mother, Margaret, remembers bundling with Sarah's father 23 years ago. Different bed, same ritual, same nervous energy, same whispered conversations in the dark. She knows exactly what's happening 20 feet away, and she's fine with it. Because bundling isn't about sex. Not really. It's about testing compatibility. Can Samuel make Sarah laugh? Does she feel safe with him? Do they actually like each other when nobody else is watching? Samuel's heart is pounding so hard, he's sure Sarah can hear it. This is his first time bundling. He's 17, she's 17, and they're lying in bed together with her parents' permission. It feels impossible and completely normal at the same time. In the darkness, Sarah reaches across the board and finds his hand. Her fingers are cold, his are sweating despite the frigid air. They start talking, quietly, carefully, about everything and nothing. This is how courtship works in their world. No secret meetings, no stolen kisses behind the barn. Everything happens with community approval and parental oversight. If Sarah gets pregnant, and statistics say there's a 30% chance she will, there are witnesses. Samuel can't deny he was courting her seriously. He can't abandon her. The whole community saw him bundling with her week after week. That accountability is the point. European visitors to New England are horrified by bundling. A British officer writes in 1770 about being offered a bed to share with a young woman whose father casually mentions, "You won't be the first man our Jemima has bundled with." To outsiders, it looks like chaos, like Puritan parents have lost their minds. But the statistics tell a different story. Rural communities that practice bundling have lower rates of abandoned mothers than cities that forbid it. Back in Sarah's bed, the wooden board feels less important than it did an hour ago. They're talking about their families, their hopes, whether they think they'd work well running a farm together. Samuel tells her about the land his father might give him. Sarah shares her worries about childbirth, about whether she's ready for marriage. These conversations can't happen in a cold parlour with parents listening openly, but here, in the darkness, they can be honest. As dawn approaches, Margaret stirs in the next room. Soon she'll wake the young couple, Samuel will walk home, and Sarah will start her chores. But something has shifted between them tonight. They know each other differently now. Whether they'll marry remains to be seen, but if they do, it won't be because their parents arranged it. It'll be because they chose each other in the strangest, most practical courtship ritual imaginable. Life in the harsh New England. Picture this. It's 1720, Massachusetts, February. The wind's howling through cracks in your cabin walls. Your single fireplace is burning whatever wood you could chop before the snow got too deep. And here's the thing about colonial New England winters. They weren't just cold, they were survival cold. The kind where families huddled together in one room, because heating 2 rooms meant you might freeze to death in the 3rd month of winter when your wood ran out. Most colonial families lived in houses we'd consider tiny today. 1 or 2 rooms total, maybe a loft if you were doing well. The whole family, parents, kids, sometimes grandparents, all crammed into a space smaller than most modern apartments. Privacy wasn't even a concept. It was survival architecture. Every square foot had to justify itself. Could this space help keep us alive through winter? If not, it was a luxury they couldn't afford. Now here's where it gets interesting. Heating wasn't just difficult. It was expensive as hell. Wood had to be chopped, dried, stored. Coal was imported and cost a fortune. Candles were handmade from animal fat or imported wax. Once the sun went down, you had maybe 2 or 3 hours of light before it became too costly to stay awake. Everything revolved around conserving heat and fuel. Every decision came back to, will this help us survive until spring? So imagine you're a father in this world. Your daughter Sarah has been courting young John Miller from 3 farms over. He rides here on winter evenings to spend time with her. Traditional European courtship said they should sit in a parlour, but you don't have a parlour, you have 1 room, and keeping a separate space warm and lit for their courtship would mean burning precious resources your family needs to survive. It's literally a choice between romance and freezing. The math was brutal but simple. Firewood to heat the main room, that's essential. Candles to light their courtship area, that's another expense. Meanwhile, your daughter's bed is already warm from shared body heat. The covers are already there. Why waste fuel heating 2 spaces when 1 would do? It wasn't about being permissive or modern. It was about not dying in February because you spent your heating budget on courtship etiquette. And here's what really gets me about this. Modern people think our ancestors were prudish, but they were actually way more practical about bodies and intimacy than we are. In a 1-room house you heard everything, saw everything. Bodies weren't mysterious or shameful, they were just part of life. Parents shared beds with children to keep warm. Siblings bunked together. Physical closeness was survival, not scandal. So letting courting couples share a bed, just another practical accommodation. The alternative was watching your fuel supplies dwindle while maintaining Victorian standards that hadn't even been invented yet. Families who tried to keep separate courting spaces warm often ran out of wood by March. Their choice became maintain proper courtship protocol and risk everyone freezing, or bundle the young couple together and save resources. Most chose survival. The environment basically forced them to develop bundling as an economic necessity, not a moral choice. Winter nights lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of darkness when you couldn't work, couldn't travel, couldn't do much except talk and stay warm. For courting couples, this was actually precious time. They could get to know each other in ways that busy daylight hours didn't allow, but only if parents could afford to keep them warm and comfortable. Bundling solved this perfectly intimate conversation time without the crushing expense of maintaining separate heated spaces. The genius was in the supervision. Parents weren't abandoning their daughters to whatever might happen. They were sleeping in the next room or the same room, listening, available, but not wasting precious heat on empty spaces. It was chaperoned intimacy with economic efficiency. The board down the middle of the bed, that was theatre. Everyone knew it, but it showed the parents had tried to maintain some boundaries while still being practical about their heating bills. What's wild is how perfectly this system matched the reality of colonial life. Marriages needed to be practical partnerships for survival. You couldn't afford to marry someone who couldn't handle the brutal intimacy of shared spaces, shared resources, shared everything. Bundling gave couples a taste of that reality. If they couldn't handle spending a night in the same bed under parental supervision, how would they handle sharing a one-room cabin through 10 years of brutal winters? By the early 1700s, bundling had evolved from desperate improvisation to accepted custom. Families passed down bundling etiquette like any other social skill. Visitors wrote about it as a normal part of New England courtship. What started as pure economic necessity, staying alive through winter while allowing young people to court, had become a social institution. The harsh environment hadn't just shaped their architecture and farming, it had literally created their approach to love and marriage. The European influence and evolution of bundling. Here's what's wild about bundling. It wasn't some weird American invention. This whole practice came straight from Europe. Rural parts of Wales, Scotland, the Netherlands. They'd been doing this for generations before the first Puritans ever set foot on American soil. But here's where it gets interesting. What started as a simple economic solution in European farming communities became something totally different when it crossed the Atlantic. Different climate, different communities, different social pressures, and those differences would eventually tear the practice completely apart. In Wales they called it carw wain wy gwely, literally courting in bed. Welsh farming families had been doing this since medieval times. Same story in the Scottish Highlands and rural Netherlands. Long, brutal winters, tiny houses with one fireplace. When your nearest neighbour lives 3 miles away and winter nights last 14 hours, you don't waste fuel heating extra rooms for courting. So couples bundled. Shared warmth, shared blankets, long conversations in the dark. It was practical, it was economical, and yeah, it worked. Nobody questioned it, because everyone understood the logic. When European settlers brought bundling to America, it made even more sense. New England winters were worse than anything back home. Houses were smaller, families bigger, fuel scarcer, so bundling thrived in colonial America like nowhere else. The 1680s, first written mentions. By the 1720s, it's everywhere. Rural families defending it as practical Christianity. Ministers writing sermons about it. And here's the thing. Initially, most people supported it. Church leaders, community elders, parents. They saw bundling as moral courtship, supervised intimacy, a way to test compatibility while maintaining standards. But something started shifting in the mid-1700s. Cities grew, trade increased, coastal communities had more contact with European visitors who were absolutely horrified by bundling. British naval officers writing home about the shocking customs of colonial courtship, French traders calling it barbaric. Slowly, urban Americans started seeing their own traditions through foreign eyes, and what they saw, well, it didn't look so respectable anymore. The same practice that had been perfectly normal for generations suddenly seemed backward, rural, embarrassing. The seeds of doubt were planted. By the 1760s, the debate was raging. Urban ministers preaching against bundling from city pulpits, rural ministers defending it from country churches, pamphlets flying back and forth, letters to newspapers. And underneath all this arguing was something bigger. America trying to figure out what kind of society it wanted to be. European and sophisticated, or practical and traditional. The bundling debate wasn't really about bundling, it was about identity, about morality, about whether American customs could stand up to European judgment. And that question was tearing communities apart. The anti-bundling crowd had some serious ammunition. Those pregnancy statistics we talked about earlier, 40% of rural brides pregnant at marriage. Critics pointed to those numbers and said, see, bundling leads to sin. They wrote satirical poems mocking country families, published essays calling bundling a corruption of Christian values, and slowly, their message started sticking. Even families who had practiced bundling for generations began questioning whether they were doing the right thing. The moral ground was shifting underneath everyone's feet. Change was coming. What really killed bundling wasn't moral arguments, it was money. As New England got wealthier in the late 1700s, families could afford to heat extra rooms, could afford candles for evening courtship, could afford privacy without freezing. The economic necessity that had justified bundling for centuries just disappeared. Suddenly you could court properly, by European standards, without going broke. And once that happened, bundling stopped being practical and started being a choice. And choices, especially controversial ones, get judged differently than necessities. By the 1780s, the cultural divide was complete. Cities had banned bundling entirely. Parlour courtship was the new standard. Sofas instead of beds. Supervised conversation instead of intimate bundling. But rural communities fought back hard. They saw urban courtship as fake, pretentious, dangerous. City girls have more babies without husbands than we do, they argued. And you know what? They weren't wrong. Urban areas had higher illegitimacy rates than rural bundling communities. But facts didn't matter anymore. The cultural tide had turned. Bundling was losing. The final nail in bundling's coffin came from an unexpected source: young people themselves. Second and third generation Americans, especially educated ones, started rejecting their parents' customs. They wanted to be modern, sophisticated, European. Bundling felt embarrassing, backward, something to hide from outsiders. So even in rural communities, young couples began choosing parlour courtship over bundling, not because their parents forced them, but because they wanted to distance themselves from what they saw as old-fashioned country customs. The tradition was dying from within. By 1800, bundling was essentially dead in most of New England. A few isolated communities held on until the 1820s, but they were fighting a losing battle. The practice that had seemed perfectly moral and practical for over a century was now seen as scandalous, primitive, unchristian. Same behaviour, completely different interpretation. And that shift, that tells us everything about how societies change, not through dramatic revolutions, but through gradual changes in what feels normal, what feels acceptable, what feels shameful. The death of bundling marked something bigger than the end of one courtship custom. It represented America's first major cultural identity crisis. The moment when Americans decided that European approval mattered more than their own traditions. That sophistication trumped practicality. That appearances were more important than community accountability. In many ways, the bundling debate set the template for every cultural battle America would fight afterward. Old ways versus new ways, rural versus urban, practical versus proper. And once that pattern was established, well, we're still fighting those same battles today. The unexpected freedom. Women in control. Here's what's wild about bundling. It actually gave women power. Real power. In a world where fathers chose husbands and daughters had zero say. Bundling flipped the script. The woman and her family controlled everything. Who got to bundle? When it happened? Under what conditions? Think about Sarah, 17, living on a farm outside Hartford in 1748. 3 different men want to court her, but Sarah and her parents, they're the ones calling the shots. Sarah's not some passive flower waiting to be picked. Her father John needs help on the farm, sure, but he's not desperate. They own good land, decent livestock. They're doing fine, which means Sarah doesn't have to marry the first man who shows interest. She can be choosy, And bundling, that's her testing ground. Her parents aren't just going to hand her over to any smooth talker who rides up. He's got to prove himself worthy of their daughter's bed. Enter Samuel. 22, owns a small farm 10 miles north. He's been watching Sarah at church for months. Finally works up courage to approach her father. But here's the thing, Samuel can't just demand to court Sarah. He has to ask permission. From her father first, yes, but also Sarah gets a say. If she's not interested, if she finds him boring or rude or just doesn't like his laugh, no bundling, Samuel goes home empty-handed. Her choice matters. John sits Samuel down for what we'd call a job interview today. What are your prospects? How much land do you own? Are you in debt? Can you support a wife? What about children? Samuel sweats through his best shirt answering these questions. But John's not the only one evaluating. Sarah's mother Mary watches from the kitchen, listening to every word. And Sarah, she's upstairs, but she can hear everything. This isn't arranged marriage. This is Sarah's family screening potential husbands for her. After Samuel leaves, the family holds council. John liked him well enough. Mary thinks he seems honest, hard-working. But the real question is, what does Sarah think? She comes downstairs and they talk. She found him a bit nervous, which is actually good. Shows he takes this seriously. His hands looked strong. Good for farm work. He didn't interrupt when she spoke after church last week. That's important. Sarah gives her preliminary approval. Samuel can come calling again. 3 weeks of regular visits. Samuel comes every Saturday evening. Sits in the cold parlour, making awkward conversation. Sarah serves him cider. They talk about weather and crops and church sermons. It's pleasant enough, but they're not really getting to know each other. They're performing, being polite. Sarah can't tell if she actually likes him, or just likes the idea of him. That's when Mary makes the suggestion. Maybe it's time to try bundling. Let them really talk. But there are conditions. Mary lays them out like a contract. Samuel bundles with Sarah in her room, but the bedroom door stays open. No funny business. Mary and John will be sleeping in the next room and they'll hear everything. If Samuel steps out of line even once, he's banned from the house forever. If Sarah feels uncomfortable at any point, she just has to call out and her parents will remove him immediately. Her safety, her comfort, her rules. Sarah helps prepare the bundling board, a thick oak plank that'll run down the middle of her bed. She's not naive. She knows the board won't stop anything if they both want something to happen. But that's not the point. The board is a symbol, a reminder. It says her parents trust her to make good decisions, and they're trusting Samuel to respect their daughter. The power dynamic is crystal clear. Samuel is a guest in Sarah's bed. She sets the boundaries. This is revolutionary for 1748. Most women had their marriages arranged by fathers, who saw daughters as economic assets to be traded. But bundling families like Sarah's, they're treating their daughters as people with preferences and judgment. Sarah gets to test Samuel's character when he thinks no one's watching, when he's comfortable and unguarded. Can he be trusted alone with her? Is he kind when he's not trying to impress her parents? That's invaluable information. And if Sarah decides Samuel isn't right for her, she can end it. No harm done. He goes back to his farm. She considers other suitors. But if pregnancy happens during bundling, that's different. Then Samuel has to marry her or face the entire community's wrath, because everyone knows he was courting her seriously, with her family's permission. He can't claim ignorance or innocence. The bundling creates accountability that protects Sarah from abandonment, while giving her genuine choice in her partner. So bundling wasn't just about saving firewood or keeping warm during long winter courtships. It was about giving women like Sarah unprecedented control over the most important decision of their lives, who they'd marry. Yes, it was risky. Yes, pregnancies happened. But for the first time in centuries, ordinary women could test potential husbands privately, intimately, and on their own terms. That's not the oppression we'd expect from Puritans. That's something closer to freedom. The rituals of bundling: blankets, boards, and sacks. Sarah's mother pulled the heavy woolen board from behind the kitchen hearth. 3 feet wide, 6 feet long, worn smooth from years of use. Tonight Samuel would bundle with their daughter. This wasn't scandalous, this was Tuesday. The board would slide down the centre of Sarah's narrow bed, a wooden promise of propriety. But first, the preparations. Because bundling wasn't just climbing into bed together, it was ritual. Theatre, a careful dance of desire and restraint that entire families participated in. 7 o'clock. Samuel knocked twice on the Miller farmhouse door. Sarah's father answered with a knowing nod. Evening, Samuel. Sarah's finishing her evening prayers. The parlour sat cold and dark. No point wasting firewood tonight. Samuel waited by the kitchen fire, hands behind his back, trying not to think about what came next. This was his 4th time bundling with Sarah. The first had been awkward beyond belief. Tonight felt different, more charged. Sarah appeared in the doorway wearing her heaviest winter shift, thick wool stockings pulled high, ready. The bundling sack hung from a peg near Sarah's bed. Coarse linen, sewn tight except for the opening at the top. Sarah's grandmother had made it 15 years earlier for Sarah's older sister. Now it waited for Sarah. Into the sack, daughter, her mother instructed, holding it open. Sarah stepped in, legs first, then hips. The fabric pulled tight around her waist, her arms trapped inside. Only her head and shoulders emerged from the top. She looked ridiculous. She looked beautiful. Samuel couldn't stop staring at her face. Samuel kept his clothes on. Breeches, shirt, stockings, everything except his heavy coat. Sarah's mother watched him like a hawk as he approached the bed. "The board goes here," she announced, sliding the wooden plank lengthwise down the mattress centre. It divided the narrow bed perfectly in half. Samuel on the left side, Sarah sealed in her sack on the right. "We'll be in the next room," her father warned. "We hear everything." The parents retreated 6 feet away, separated only by a thin wooden wall. Privacy was an illusion. Sarah wriggled under the heavy quilt, her movements restricted by the bundling sack. Samuel slid carefully onto his side of the bed, the wooden board cold against his hip. The mattress dipped under their combined weight, rolling them slightly toward the centre. Their faces ended up inches apart across the board. Sarah's breath warmed his cheek. "This is ridiculous," she whispered, struggling against the sack. "I feel like a trussed chicken." Samuel bit back laughter. Her parents would definitely hear if he lost control and started laughing out loud. The candle flickered on the bedside table, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Sarah's mother had left it burning, barely, just enough light to see faces, not enough to read expressions clearly. Samuel studied Sarah's profile in the dim glow. Her dark hair spilled across the pillow. Her eyes caught the candlelight. 4 months of formal courting, and this was the most intimate they'd ever been. Lying in her bed, under her family's roof, with her parents listening in the next room, the whole situation felt surreal, forbidden, and completely normal simultaneously. Sarah worked her arms free inside the sack, somehow managing to get one hand to the opening. Her fingers emerged, pale in the candlelight. Samuel reached across the board without thinking, their fingertips touching. Electric. That's the only word for it. Her skin was impossibly soft, warm despite the cold room. They'd held hands during Sunday services, briefly, with her gloves on. This was different. Raw skin contact while lying in bed together. Even with the board between them, even with her trapped in linen, this felt dangerous, thrilling, absolutely against every rule they'd been taught. A floorboard creaked in the next room. Sarah's father, reminding them of his presence. Their hands jerked apart. The board suddenly felt less like separation, and more like protection, protection from themselves. "Tell me something secret," Sarah whispered. So quietly Samuel had to lean closer to hear. "Something you've never told anyone." Her request hung in the air between them. The darkness made confessions easier somehow. When you couldn't see someone's full reaction, words came easier. Truths felt safer. Samuel took a breath, gathering courage for something he'd never said aloud. "I think about you constantly," Samuel whispered back, his voice barely audible. "During morning prayers, during evening chores, when I'm supposed to be concentrating on other things, it's becoming a problem." Sarah's eyes widened in the dim light. This was exactly what bundling was designed for. Intimate confessions that formal parlour courting couldn't accommodate. Truth-telling in darkness, building trust through vulnerability. "I think about you too," she admitted. "More than I should, more than my mother would approve of." Their secret hung between them, dangerous and precious. The candle burned lower. Sarah struggled again against her bundling sack, this time more urgently. "I hate being trapped like this," she whispered. "I want to touch your face." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. The board felt flimsy suddenly, 3 inches of pine between them, and complete impropriety. He could hear her parents breathing in the next room, deep and regular. Were they actually asleep, or lying awake listening? Impossible to know. Sarah's hand found the sack's opening again. This time she managed to work her entire arm free, reaching across the forbidden territory above the board. Her fingertips traced Samuel's jawline in the dying candlelight. Soft, hesitant, reverent. This was as close as they'd ever been, as intimate as bundling allowed under her parents' watchful supervision. "I want to marry you," Samuel breathed, the words escaping before he could stop them. Sarah's hand stilled against his cheek. The confession hung in the dim air between them, their futures suddenly visible in the space above that wooden board. From the next room came the sound of her father's gentle snoring. Some secrets, apparently, were safe to whisper in the darkness. Rules and repercussions. Breaking the chastity pledge. 3 months of bundling between Samuel and Sarah. 3 months of whispered conversations, shared warmth, and increasingly bold touches beneath those useless wooden boards. By now, the theoretical chastity of bundling had, well, let's just say theory and practice weren't exactly aligned. And Samuel and Sarah weren't alone in this. Across New England, bundling beds were producing more than just marriages. They were producing babies, lots of them. And when that happened, the real test of the bundling system began. Remember those statistics I mentioned? 30 to 40% of New England brides pregnant at marriage. Some communities hitting 50%. This wasn't accidental. This was bundling working exactly as everyone knew it would. The wooden boards, the bundling sacks, the parental supervision, it was all theatre. Elaborate theatre designed to make everyone feel better about what was obviously going to happen. Because here's the thing nobody wants to admit. The Puritans knew, the parents knew, the Pumities knew, and they had a plan for dealing with it. Sarah missed her monthly bleeding in February, then again in March. By early April, the morning sickness started. She knew, her mother knew from the way Sarah couldn't keep down breakfast. Samuel knew from the way Sarah looked at him during their bundling sessions. A mixture of fear and something else, resignation. Hope, it's April 1782, and Sarah is 17 years old, pregnant, and technically unmarried. In our world, this would be a crisis. In hers, it was just Tuesday, because the system had a protocol for this exact situation. Sarah's father didn't rage, didn't throw Samuel out, didn't call him a scoundrel, or threaten him with a musket. Instead, he called Samuel into the parlour for what he termed a necessary conversation. Because here's what made bundling work. Accountability. Sarah's parents had witnesses. Neighbours had seen Samuel bundling with Sarah 6, 7, 8 times over 3 months. The community knew this was serious courtship. Samuel couldn't claim he barely knew her, couldn't disappear into the wilderness. The community would hold him responsible, and they had ways of enforcing that responsibility. The conversation was brief. Samuel's choices were simple: marry Sarah immediately and legitimize the child, or face breach of promise charges that would ruin his reputation and cost him everything his family owned in damages. But here's the twist. Samuel didn't need to be forced. He wanted to marry Sarah anyway. The bundling had worked. They'd gotten to know each other, liked each other, maybe even loved each other. The pregnancy just moved up their timeline. The wedding that might have happened in the fall would happen in May instead. Sarah felt relief flood through her when Samuel smiled and took her hand. "I was planning to ask your father for permission next month anyway," he told her privately. The baby decided for us." This wasn't shame. This wasn't scandal. This was life happening faster than planned. But still, according to the script, everyone understood. The community had seen this hundreds of times before. Young couples bundling, getting carried away, marrying quickly, having healthy babies 8 months later. It was so common there were jokes about it. The wedding preparations began immediately. Sarah's mother started sewing a larger wedding dress to accommodate the growing belly. Samuel's father negotiated the farm arrangements that would give the young couple land to start their own household. The church bans were posted, and if anyone in the community disapproved of the obvious pregnancy, they kept it to themselves, because this was how the system worked. Bundling led to sex. Sex led to pregnancy. Pregnancy led to marriage. Marriage led to legitimate children and stable families. But not every bundling story ended like Samuel and Sarah's. Some young men tried to run when pregnancy appeared. That's when the community's enforcement mechanisms kicked in hard. Church discipline, social ostracism, economic pressure, legal action. Families would pursue breach of promise suits that could financially destroy a man's entire family. The message was clear: if you bundled seriously with a young woman, you were making a commitment. The community would hold you to that commitment, whether you wanted it or not. Parish records from this period show a fascinating pattern: a surge of marriages in late spring and early summer, followed by births 7 or 8 months later, the bundling marriages as they were sometimes called. Hasty but not shameful, quick but not scandalous. These weren't shotgun weddings in the sense of forced unions between strangers. These were couples who'd been courting seriously, just moved along faster than originally planned. The pregnancy wasn't a crisis. It was confirmation that the courtship had reached its natural conclusion. Samuel and Sarah married on May 15th, 1782. Sarah was 4 months pregnant and showing. Nobody pretended otherwise. The minister who performed the ceremony had married dozens of couples in identical circumstances. Their first child, a healthy boy named Thomas, was born in September, 7 months after the wedding, 8 months after conception. The timing fooled no one, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Thomas was born legitimate, to married parents, in a stable home with community support. Looking back, Samuel and Sarah's story reveals bundling's real purpose. It wasn't about preventing premarital sex. That was never realistic. It was about channeling inevitable human sexuality towards stable families and legitimate children. The wooden boards and bundling sacks were props in a community theatre performance where everyone knew their role. The surprise wasn't that bundling couples had sex. The surprise was how effectively the system turned passion into lasting partnerships. Samuel and Sarah went on to have 6 more children together, and a marriage that lasted 43 years. Witnesses of society, the messy bundle. Here's what nobody tells you about bundling: it got messy. Real messy. Those pregnancy rates we talked about, 30 to 40% of brides walking down the aisle already showing. Critics were having a field day. Scandalous, they cried. Immoral. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. Bundling wasn't failing. It was working exactly as designed. because when Sarah showed up pregnant, everyone knew exactly who'd been visiting her bed for months. The whispers started immediately. Did you hear about the Miller girl, caught with child before the wedding? But here's where bundling showed its genius. There were witnesses. Her parents knew Thomas had been courting seriously. Neighbours saw him arriving for bundling sessions week after week. The church recorded his public intentions. When that pregnancy became obvious, Thomas couldn't just disappear into the night, claiming he barely knew her. The entire community had watched their courtship unfold. Think about what happened to women who got pregnant in secret back then. No witnesses, no proof of serious courtship. Just a woman pointing at some man saying he's the father and him shrugging, denying everything. She'd be ruined, shunned, raising a bastard child alone. But bundling couples? They had documentation, parents who'd given permission, neighbours who'd witnessed months of proper courtship. The man couldn't escape responsibility because the whole community had watched him pursue her seriously. Court records from 1760s Connecticut tell the story. Mary Woodhouse versus John Stevens. Breach of promise. Her father testified, "He bundled with my daughter 11 times over 4 months. Her neighbour saw him at their house every Sunday evening. The minister, he declared intentions to marry before the congregation. When Mary turned up pregnant, John tried to deny everything. The judge laughed him out of court. Pay up or marry her. John chose marriage. This is where bundling becomes brilliant social engineering. Parents weren't naive. They knew putting young people in bed together might lead to pregnancy. But they also knew that pregnancy within witness courtship was infinitely better than secret seduction. The shame wouldn't fall entirely on their daughter. The man couldn't abandon her without facing the entire community's wrath. Wedding dates just got moved up a few months. Problem solved. Child legitimate. Everyone moves on. The accountability system was ruthless. Church discipline records show exactly how it worked. Thomas Miller, having gotten Sarah Wilson with child before marriage, is required to confess his sin publicly and pay a fine of £5. But notice, he's not banished, he's not shunned. He confesses, pays the fine, marries Sarah, and life continues. Sarah faces discipline too, but as a wife, not a ruined woman. The child is born legitimate. The community has solved the problem efficiently. Critics wrote angry poems mocking bundling. Young folks who bundle don't stay chaste. Their morals gone completely to waste. But rural communities fired back with statistics that are absolutely savage. A 1776 minister complained about bundling to country women. Their response? City ladies with their sofas send more fatherless children into the world than we do. Translation: your proper courtship creates more abandoned pregnant women than our scandalous bundling ever did. Legal documents show how protection worked in practice. Whereas Benjamin Clark hath frequently bundled with Mercy Adams with her parents' consent and knowledge, and she being now with child by him, he is bound to marry her or pay damages of £20. £20 was serious money, more than most men made in months. Communities weren't messing around. You court seriously, you take responsibility. No exceptions, no escape clauses. This system protected women in ways we barely recognize today. In an era when women had almost no legal rights, bundling gave them witnesses, community support, proof of serious courtship that courts would accept. A pregnant woman could stand before a judge with her father saying, "This man bundled with my daughter 20 times, and neighbours confirming months of obvious courtship. Try denying paternity after that." The community made denial impossible. So yes, bundling was messy. Pregnancies happened. Weddings got rushed. Ministers preached angry sermons. But beneath all that mess was an ingenious framework that refused to let women bear the consequences alone. Every bundling couple had witnesses. Every pregnancy had accountability. Every child had a father who couldn't disappear. It wasn't perfect, but it was protection wrapped in a very strange practical package that somehow worked better than anything that came after. Changes upon the horizon. The decline of bundling. Boston, 1756. Something's shifting in the cobblestone streets and brick townhouses. The same families who've bundled for generations. They're starting to whisper, starting to question, is this practice really appropriate for refined society? The merchants' wives are talking. The ministers in their fancy city pulpits are preaching against country customs. And slowly, quietly, the bed courting that built colonial America is getting pushed out of the sophisticated neighborhoods. This is where everything changes. It started in the cities first. Boston, Salem, Newport, places where money was flowing, where European fashions mattered, where families wanted to seem sophisticated. Around 1756, you start seeing newspaper articles questioning bundling, ministers calling it backward, rustic, something country folk do. The wealthy families are the first to ban it outright. They've got bigger houses now, separate parlours, money for coal to heat courting rooms. Why would their daughters need to bundle like some farmer's girl? Here's what's fascinating. This isn't about morality yet. Not really. It's about class. City families are embarrassed that European visitors find bundling shocking. They want to seem civilized, refined, modern. A British merchant writes home in 1762, the better sort of people in Boston have given up the barbarous custom of bed courting. Barbarous, that word shows up everywhere now. What their grandparents considered perfectly normal is suddenly primitive, embarrassing, something to be ashamed of. But the real killer? The sofa. Yeah, you heard that right. The decline of bundling has furniture involved. Wealthy families start importing these new things called sofas from Europe. Suddenly there's a way to court that looks sophisticated, sitting side by side, but not too close, in a proper parlour with a fire going and parents nearby. It's controlled, it's visible, it's definitely not lying in bed together in the dark. The sofa becomes the symbol of proper courtship. Then Victorian ideas start creeping in from England. This is the 1780s, 1790s. New ideas about female purity are crossing the Atlantic. Women aren't just supposed to be chaste until marriage anymore. They're supposed to be completely innocent, pure, untouched by any hint of sexual knowledge. And bundling? Well, bundling assumes young women have sexual feelings, that they might enjoy intimate conversation with men, that they're human. Victorian morality can't handle that. The ministers leading the charge aren't country preachers who understood their communities. These are educated, urban clergymen who've never seen a farmhouse with one heated room. They preach about temptation, about the impossibility of young people maintaining virtue while sharing a bed. One Boston minister in 1788 calls bundling a practice that inevitably leads to corruption of the purest hearts. He's never lived through a New England winter, never understood why bundling existed in the first place. What's heartbreaking is watching the generational split happen. Mothers who bundled with their husbands are now forbidding their daughters from the same practice. A diary from Salem, 1791. Mother says bundling is no longer respectable for our family. We must receive callers in the parlour only. The daughter sounds confused, lost. The traditions that connected her to her grandmother are suddenly shameful. The knowledge passed down through generations, gone in one decision. The genius was in the witnesses. Every bundling session had implicit community approval. Parents gave permission. Neighbours knew about it. Extended family watched the courtship progress. When pregnancy happened, it wasn't some shameful secret. It was documented proof of a serious relationship. The man had invested months courting properly. He couldn't claim this was casual sex or deny paternity. The community had watched him pursue her with marriage clearly in mind. The rural communities fight back hard. Remember those country women who confronted that preacher? They're not giving up without a fight. Rural newspapers published defences of bundling throughout the 1790s. One writes, city ladies with their sofas send more fatherless children into the world than we do with our bundling boards. They know their system works. They've seen it prevent abandonment, ensure marriage, protect their daughters. But they're losing the cultural war. By 1800, bundling is essentially dead in urban areas. The last generation to practice it regularly is aging out. Their children are courting on sofas, in parlours, with rigid rules about chaperoning and proper distance. The pregnancy rates that critics blamed on bundling, they don't disappear. They just become more hidden, more shameful. Women who get pregnant outside marriage face total social exile now. The accountability system is gone. What replaced bundling wasn't better. It was just more hypocritical. Victorian courtship created impossible standards of purity, while providing no practical protection for women who fell short. The community oversight that made bundling work, gone. The family involvement in courtship, minimized. Young people were left to navigate sexuality and relationships alone, with no guidance except don't. And when they inevitably did anyway, there was no system to ensure accountability, just shame. The death of bundling marks the end of honest conversations about sexuality in America for over a century. What had been practical, community-supported and protective became secretive, individual, and dangerous. Victorian morality painted itself as more pure than Puritan morality, but the statistics tell a different story. More abandoned women, more children without fathers, more shame and less actual protection. Sometimes progress isn't. Sometimes the old ways knew something we forgot. Legacy of bundling, a historical perspective. So bundling didn't just disappear overnight. It died slowly, awkwardly, like most things that suddenly become embarrassing. By the 1820s, what had been normal courtship practice for over a century was being whispered about like some shameful family secret. The same communities that had defended bundling against city ministers were now pretending it never happened. But here's the thing about cultural practices. They don't really disappear. They transform. They leave fingerprints on everything that comes after. And bundling's fingerprints are all over American attitudes towards sex, marriage, and morality. The death of bundling wasn't natural evolution. It was murder by embarrassment. As cities grew and Victorian morality spread westward, rural New Englanders started feeling judged. City newspapers mocked bundling as backward farmer behaviour. Conduct books for young ladies declared it vulgar. Ministers who'd once ignored it suddenly preached against it. By 1850, former bundling families were denying they'd ever participated. Elderly women who'd bundled with their husbands 50 years earlier would change the subject when grandchildren asked about courtship in the old days. The practice became unspeakable. Victorian Americans created a mythology around their Puritan ancestors that was completely wrong but incredibly powerful. They painted Puritans as sexually repressed prudes who never acknowledged physical desire. Bundling didn't fit this narrative, so it got erased. History books stopped mentioning it. When they did, they treated it like some bizarre aberration rather than standard practice. The truth, that Puritans had a practical, realistic approach to sexuality, was too threatening to Victorian sensibilities. They needed their ancestors to be more prudish than they actually were, so they rewrote history. This erasure worked so well that by 1900, most Americans had never heard of bundling. When historians occasionally mentioned it, readers reacted with shock and disbelief. How could God-fearing Puritans have allowed unmarried couples to sleep together? It must have been rare. They insisted. Or it must have involved only the lowest classes. The idea that respectable Puritan families routinely permitted bed courting was too scandalous to accept, so they convinced themselves it was either exaggerated or invented entirely. Denial became historical fact, and that denial shaped how we think about American sexual history. We still carry these Victorian misconceptions today. When most people think Puritan, they picture sexually repressed killjoys who thought bodies were shameful and pleasure was sinful. But the bundling evidence proves this is fantasy. Real Puritans understood that young people had sexual desires and would act on them regardless of rules, so they created systems to channel those desires toward marriage rather than abandonment. They were pragmatic, not prudish. The prudes came later. Victorian Americans were far more sexually restrictive than their Puritan ancestors ever were. We've got our timelines completely backward. Think about what bundling actually reveals about Puritan society. These were people who valued community oversight, personal responsibility, and practical solutions to human problems. They didn't pretend young people wouldn't have sex. They just insisted it happen within structures that protected everyone involved. Women got witnesses to their courtships. Men got held accountable for their promises. Communities got legitimate children instead of abandoned bastards. It was messy, imperfect, but it worked. Compare that to Victorian hypocrisy that preached purity while tolerating massive prostitution and illegitimacy. Which system actually protected women better? Modern dating could learn from bundling's accountability systems. Today we have complete privacy in courtship, which sounds liberating until someone gets hurt. No witnesses to promises made. No community pressure to follow through on commitments. We've swung from too much oversight to virtually none. Bundling couples couldn't abandon each other without consequences because everyone knew about their relationship. Modern couples can ghost each other with zero social cost. Maybe total privacy isn't always better than community involvement. Maybe the Puritans understood something about human nature that we've forgotten in our rush toward individualism. The irony is staggering when you look at the numbers. Puritan New England, with its scandalous bundling practice, had lower rates of illegitimacy and abandoned mothers than Victorian America, with its strict moral codes. Bundling communities also had more stable marriages and fewer divorces. The system that looked immoral actually produced more moral outcomes. This reveals something crucial about human behavior. Systems that acknowledge reality work better than systems that ignore it. Puritans dealt with sexuality honestly. Victorians created elaborate hypocrisies. Guess which approach actually protected families and communities better? Academic historians didn't rediscover bundling until the 1960s, when researchers started digging into colonial court records and parish registers. What they found shocked them. Pregnancy rates before marriage, detailed testimonies about bed courting, evidence that this wasn't some marginal practice but mainstream behaviour in rural New England for over a century. Suddenly scholars realised they'd been telling American sexual history completely wrong. The sexual revolution wasn't the first time Americans had practical attitudes toward premarital sex. The Puritans had figured it out centuries earlier. We'd just forgotten because it was too embarrassing to remember. What can bundling teach us today? Maybe that moral systems need to account for human nature rather than ignore it. Maybe that community involvement in relationships isn't automatically oppressive if it provides real protection. Maybe that sexual practices should be judged by their outcomes, not their appearance. Bundling looked scandalous but produced stable families. Victorian courtship looked proper but left many women vulnerable and abandoned. The lesson isn't that we should bring back bundling, it's that we should think more carefully about what actually protects people versus what just looks respectable. Bundling's real legacy isn't the practice itself, it's what it reveals about the complexity of American sexual history. We're not the first generation to struggle with balancing desire and responsibility, individual freedom, and community standards. The Puritans found solutions that worked for their time and circumstances. Those solutions seem strange to us now, but they weren't random. They were responses to real human needs and social problems. Understanding bundling helps us understand that sexual morality isn't fixed, it adapts to conditions. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe adaptation is exactly what healthy societies do. Beyond the night, the end of Samuel and Sarah's tale. So here we are. Samuel and Sarah's story winds down like embers, settling in a winter hearth. Remember them? 17 years old, lying inches apart with that wooden board between them, hearts racing in the darkness of her family's farmhouse. 3 weeks of serious courting had led to this moment, their first bundling night. What started as nervous whispers across a plank of wood became something deeper, something that would shape 2 lives forever. That first bundling night stretched until dawn. Samuel later told his brother he barely slept, just listened to Sarah breathe, felt the warmth of her presence through their shared quilts. Sarah confided to her sister that she'd never felt so safe and terrified at the same time. They talked about everything: her father's failing crops, his plans to clear land for their own farm someday, dreams that suddenly felt possible when spoken aloud in the intimate darkness. 3 more bundling nights followed over the next month. Sarah's parents, Thomas and Mary, watched approvingly from their bed across the room. They remembered their own bundling days, how Thomas had travelled 8 miles on foot every Saturday evening to court Mary, how bundling had let them truly know each other's character before committing their lives together. This wasn't about looseness or sin. This was about building marriages that could survive the brutal realities of colonial life. By the 4th bundling night, something shifted. The wooden board felt like an unnecessary barrier between souls who'd already found their match. Samuel reached across, touched Sarah's hand in the darkness. She didn't pull away. What followed wasn't wild passion, but gentle discovery. 2 young people learning what it meant to be completely vulnerable with another human being. Their parents, wise in the ways of bundling, simply pretended to sleep more soundly. Spring arrived early that year. Sarah realized she was carrying Samuel's child in late March, when the snow finally melted from the north side of the barn. She told her mother first. Mary simply nodded, pulled Sarah close, and whispered, "I suspected as much. We'll tell your father tonight. Then we'll tell Samuel's family. No shame, no scandal, just practical arrangements for a wedding that would happen sooner than originally planned." This was how bundling was supposed to work. Samuel's reaction surprised everyone, including himself. When Thomas sat him down and explained the situation, Samuel's first words weren't about obligation or duty. They were about joy. "I was going to ask for her hand this summer anyway," he said quietly. "This just means our life together starts sooner." His parents, Daniel and Ruth, saw their son's genuine happiness and knew they'd raised him right. This wasn't a trap. This was love finding its natural course. The wedding took place on a sunny April morning. Reverend Thompson, who'd married dozens of bundling couples over the years, spoke about the sacred nature of commitment, the blessing of children, and the wisdom of communities that supported young love rather than condemning it. Sarah showed just slightly, a small curve beneath her best dress that everyone politely ignored. After all, the child was conceived within a recognized courtship. That made all the difference in their world. Their first child, a daughter they named Hope, arrived healthy and strong in late October. Samuel built a cradle during the September harvest, carving tiny flowers into the headboard, while Sarah watched from their own bed, the same bed where they'd bundled through those transformative nights. Looking back, they'd realized those bundling evenings taught them something precious: how to be intimate without losing themselves, how to merge 2 lives while staying whole individuals. Years later, when bundling began falling out of fashion, Samuel and Sarah would defend it to skeptical visitors from Boston. "You modern folks with your sitting rooms and chaperoned visits," Sarah would say with gentle humour, "you're missing the point. Bundling wasn't about bodies sharing space. It was about souls learning to trust completely." Their marriage lasted 53 years. They raised 7 children who all knew the story of their parents' bundling nights with pride, not embarrassment. Thomas and Mary lived to see their great-grandchildren, all born from the lineage that started with that first nervous bundling night. In their final years, they'd sit by the fire and remember hosting Samuel during those cold evenings, watching 2 young people discover love across a wooden board. They never regretted giving their daughter that freedom. Love needs time and space to grow. Bundling provided both, wrapped in the safety of family approval and community witness. So ends our journey through the bundling beds of colonial America, through Samuel and Sarah's tale of wooden boards and whispered promises, through a world where parents understood that love couldn't be legislated, only nurtured. As you settle into your own bed tonight, perhaps you'll dream of simpler times when courtship moved at the pace of seasons, when intimacy grew slowly in the darkness between two hearts, learning to beat as one. Sleep well, knowing love always finds a way.